think we are at a juncture in history that will be regarded as very meaningful, because regimes have changed and superpowers have changed for the last 7,000 years. And a change always involves some losers and some winners. I'd like to say is not everybody's going to win. And equally, we have a world that is nowadays unusual in the sense that the capitalistic system, and many people overlook this, but the capitalistic system and the adoption of it in the last 40 years, first by China in 1978 with the open door policy, a move towards free markets and the capitalistic system, and then the breakdown of the Berlin Wall in 1989, where essentially the whole of Eastern Europe and Russia became more market-oriented economies. And therefore, we have this unusually strong growth in the world after a period during which countries that were suffering under the socialist and communist ideologies hadn't progressed at all for years. I mean, I went for the first time, I'm a Swiss, so I grew up in relative affluence, but I went for the first time in the 1950s to Yugoslavia. I was a child, but even as a child, I could see how poor people were compared to our standards of living. And later, when I was ski racing for the Swiss team, we frequently went to Eastern Europe. And then I went in 1968 to Czechoslovakia and saw with my own eyes how destitute these people were that were under the communist regime. And after that, when I went for the first time in 81 to Russia, I saw markets where people were lining up to buy rotten tomatoes and rotten potatoes. I mean, incredible. And later I went to China in the late 70s also, and there was nothing. I mean, it was very difficult to get a taxi. You had to write a little report at the station how to get a taxi, and nothing worked. And people had a big choice between wearing a blue suit or a brown suit and nothing else, or a green suit. And I could see later on in my life as a broker and as an investment advisor and economist, how when people can develop their initiative, their own initiative, and can own something, that is very important in economics, the property rights, that immediately people work twice as hard and are more innovative and invent things, and the economy then breaks out on the upside like a volcanic eruption. And although the socialists and the communists always want to tell you that wealth inequality is so high in the world, yes, it is high, but I can tell you, never in history before could someone in China buy a Coca-Cola, which is being drunk by the richest people in America, and buy a hamburger. So yes, there is wealth inequality, but equally, most people in the Western world and even in emerging economies, they have now running water. How was that achieved ever before? The Romans had the running water, actually, but after the Romans, not many societies had that luxury. It's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war that was provoked by NATO, specifically the Americans, who wanted to essentially push Putin back and destroy him and get rid of him. That is a war made in the American State Department. And when the Berlin Wall fell, at the time, the Americans and the Russians sort of agreed, it was not clearly written down, but it was sort of agreed that NATO would not expand further east than what it was at that time. And what did NATO do? They included the Baltic states. I understand that people wanted to join NATO because the Russian occupation had been horrible in these countries. But the Russian had made very clear that Ukraine, being a bordering country of Russia, would not be permitted to join NATO and that it should stay neutral. But no, the Americans pushed the envelope further and further until the Russians reacted. If you look clearly at the map and the demographics of Ukraine, The eastern part is majority Russian, populated by Russian people ethnically. And the Crimea island or semi-island, that's been in Russian possession for the last few hundred years. So they didn't want to give it up. This goes back to essentially the beginning of the 20th century when an economist and geostrategist called Halford Mackinder, he established essentially a theory of the hinterland, which includes essentially China and Russia and parts of Eastern Europe. And he sort of established a view that these countries should never be one and the same because they would control the world. And then this theory was further expanded by Organskis and others, and the control of this hinterland was then done from the outside. But very clearly, the idea was you don't want Russia and China to come together. That will be a very dangerous union of mighty countries, both territory, natural resources, and population-wise. But the American State Department, in their ultimate wisdom, have precisely managed to push Russia and China to essentially unite. Nobody in the world ever managed to do that. The Chinese and the Russians always on sort of tension in terms of geopolitical tensions because of the territory and the large border with each other. The situation is very complex, and I could see a solution to Ukraine. But the solution to Ukraine is that Ukraine would have to give up some territories to Russia. And the American State Department doesn't want that, including the British, who are vassals of the US. I mean, nowadays, the whole of Europe is a vassal of the US. They don't have a foreign policy anymore. They do what the US tells them to do. But other countries look at the world differently, and geopolitical tensions, you have to realize the following. When the Second World War ended, basically we still had, until at that time, a system of Western imperialism, dominance, and colonialism. After that, what followed is neo-colonialism. In other words, countries became free, like the French gave freedom to the territories that they controlled in Africa. India became essentially independent, Pakistan as well, and so forth. And already then many mistakes were made. But this is essentially what happened. But the countries, the mother countries, Britain, France, Germany, and so forth, still had a large influence on these countries. Now, suddenly China is a giant. Not like in the 19th century when England could send an army to China and blackmail China to hand over Hong Kong to the British as a possession in the Hong Kong Island, and later on the new territories under lease. China today, there's no way any of the European countries could take on China in a military conflict. No way. America could probably do it, but at a huge cost. At a huge cost. And most likely at a huge loss as well. That we have to see. The American army is not what it used to be during the Second World War. It is a different army, and its efficiency is very questionable. I mean, an example was, of course, it was not discussed in the media because the American media protects the government and the government protects the media. Basically, if a country like America fails to build a pier that functions in the Gaza Strip, you have to ask themselves, how would they ever invade a country? I mean, it's incredible. The Mediterranean Sea is not a high wave sea with waves like you find in Honolulu elsewhere. In the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, the highest waves are maybe 1.50 meters, 2 meters maximum. I have friends who are well placed, who think that World War III is inevitable. Now, I have started to write about war cycles already 10, 15 years ago, because this is a kind of a development in history that intrigued me a lot, these war cycles. And the fact is, if you have a superpower, and the superpower is kind of a hegemon and dominates large parts of the world. Now, you have another power that then goes up or rises and overtakes the superpower. Economically speaking, the new power that is coming up will want to have more influence in the world, and so tensions increase. I'm not saying this constellation has to lead to war, but the likelihood of war increases dramatically. We have a very good example. At the end of the 19th century, between 1870 and 1900, there was an economic miracle in Germany. Germany grew very, very rapidly, and by 1910, the German economy became larger than the British economy. And that led to a lot of tensions in Europe, because historians in general agree the First World War could have been avoided. It was completely unnecessary, and it was also a complete waste of human beings. People went into trenches and they shot at each other for days and days with machine guns. And in the first battle of the British against the Germans, it's tragic. 30,000 people died within a few hours in the first battle. Concerning the war, I have to say, I personally am a little bit more optimistic, because I think that the American people will eventually realize that to impose sanctions on just about every country in the world is not very advantageous for the United States. And to reshore certain activities, we can make tennis shoes and jogging shoes in China and in Mexico and in other jurisdictions, but it doesn't really pay to make them in the US. Similarly, the semiconductor industry is well established in Asia and in other countries. They're not going to displace it just like this. And to work with subsidies is a complete nonsense. That, I have to say, as an economist and as a capitalist and free market person, to subsidize industry is a huge mistake.